It was 109 degrees in the shade, and across the high plains the cattle were dying on their feet. For 3 days, the power had been out. Every electric pump for 40 miles sat silent in the heat. And one by one, the stock tanks had gone down to cracked mud. And on the morning of the third day, down a section road so dry the dust hung in the air like smoke, men were driving what was left of their herds toward the one place in the county where water was still moving. They were driving them toward the farm of a man they had spent 30 years calling a fool. Wendell Kroll stood at the fence line of that farm. The man who had sold this whole county on the future. The man who had laughed the loudest. And he watched a windmill that nobody was supposed to need anymore turn slow against a white sky and pour clean water into a tank until it ran over the sides. He took off his hat, and for a long time, he did not say a word. What does a man see in a rusted windmill when he calls it scrap iron? And what does it cost him, 30 years later, to stand in the heat and learn he was wrong? But to understand how Emmett Roth got here, how one stubborn old man's whole life came down to a single afternoon in the summer of 1980, we have to go back to the year the power lines first reached Cimarron County. We have to go back to 1948. In 1948, the electric co-op came to the Oklahoma Panhandle, and it came like salvation. For most of these people, it was. Before the lines went up, a man watered his cattle with a windmill. A tower of galvanized steel with a fan of thin blades on top that caught the prairie wind and worked a pump rod up and down, pulling water out of the ground one slow stroke at a time. When the wind blew, you had water. When the wind died in the dead heat of August, the blades hung still, and a man hauled water by the barrel or watched his tank go dry. So when the co-op offered to run a line to your well and set an electric pump on it, you did not hesitate. An electric pump ran whether the wind blew or not. It was faster, it was steadier, and within a few years it was cheaper. The windmill became a symbol of everything these families were trying to leave behind. The hard years, the dry years, the dust bowl that had nearly emptied this county a decade before. And so a ritual took hold across the plains. When the co-op hooked up your well, you climbed the old tower, unbolted the head, and you pulled the windmill down. You sold the steel for scrap or let it rust in a fence row and never looked back. By 1955, the towers were coming down all over the Panhandle. To leave one standing was to announce that you had not moved on. It was, people agreed, a foolish, backward thing to do. Emmett Roth did not pull his windmills down. Emmett Roth was born in 1918 on a half-section 4 miles south of Boise City, and he was a boy when the dust came. He was old enough to remember it clearly. The black rollers on the horizon, the cattle blinded and choking, the neighbors loading what they could into a truck and driving west and never coming back. He remembered the year the wind quit for 6 weeks in the worst of the heat, and the family windmill stood dead still, and his father hauled water 11 miles in a wooden barrel to keep 4 cows alive. What the dust taught Emmett Roth was not a fear of drought. Every farmer feared drought. What it taught him was something narrower and stranger, and he could never quite explain it to the men at the feed store. It taught him to distrust any system that had only one way to fail. When the co-op came in 1948, Emmett hooked up an electric pump like everyone else. He was no enemy of progress, but he did not pull his windmills down. He had 4 of them on his ground, and he greased them and re-leathered the pumps and kept them turning. An insurance policy against a day that never seemed to come. Then he started buying more. When a neighbor scrapped a windmill, Emmett would drive over and offer him a few dollars for the head and the tower steel before the junk man came. Men were glad to take $5 for something they considered garbage. Emmett hauled the pieces home, rebuilt the mechanisms on his shop bench through the winter, and set them back up over old hand-dug wells on the abandoned quarters he leased for grazing. wells the co-op had never bothered to run a line to. By 1965, he had 11 working windmills scattered across his ground and the leased ground around it. By 1975, he had 19. He never explained why. When asked, he'd say only that the wind was free and it didn't need anybody's permission to blow. The men at the co-op office had a different explanation. They said Emmett Roth was living in the past. The man who said it most often was Wendell Kroll. Wendell Kroll was the co-op's field man for the northern half of the county, and it would be a mistake to paint him as a villain, because for 30 years he was, by every measure anyone used, right. Kroll had grown up dirt poor in the same dust as Emmett, and the electric line had changed his family's life. He believed in it the way some men believe in Scripture. He had spent his career driving the section roads, signing up wells, running service to farms that had never had a steady drink of water, and watching electric pumps turn hardscrabble outfits into real operations. He was not lying when he said the electric pump was better. On any ordinary day, in any ordinary year, it was. It was cheaper to run, it needed less maintenance, and it did not stop when the wind stopped. And every ordinary day for 30 years proved him right and proved Emmett Roth a fool. Kroll would see Emmett's towers from the road and shake his head. At the co-op counter, at the diner in Boise City, he had a line he liked to use. Emmett's got the finest collection of scrap iron in the panhandle, he'd say, and he greases it like it's going somewhere. The men would laugh, because it was funny, and because Kroll was the one holding the future in his hand. Emmett was pouring good winters into rebuilding pump heads for wells that already had electricity. What kind of a man does that? Once, in the summer of 1971, Kroll pulled his co-op truck up to Emmett's fence while Emmett was up a tower re-leathering a pump. "Emmett," he called up, friendly enough, "you know I can have a proper pump on that well by Thursday. Save you the climb." Emmett looked down from 40 feet up and said, "Wind's already up here, Wendell. I didn't have to wait for it." Kroll laughed and drove off. The old fool, up his tower, arguing with the future. By the late 1970s, Emmett Roth was an old man greasing 19 windmills that no one else in the county could see the point of. His electric pumps ran fine, and so did his neighbors. The windmills turned beside them, pumping water into tanks the electric pumps would have filled anyway. Every hour Emmett spent up a tower was, by the plain arithmetic of the times, an hour wasted. His herd was small. About 40 head of mixed cattle on ground he could have run harder if he'd spent his time the way sensible men spent theirs. His wife had passed in 1974, and some said the windmills were just an old widower's way of filling the days. He kept climbing anyway. He re-leathered the pumps every spring. He kept the towers plumb and the gears in oil, and wrote in a ledger which mills sat on which wells. To everyone watching, it was the routine of a man who could not let go of a dead way of life. Then came the summer of 1980. It started dry, the way bad summers do. By June the grass had cured brown and the ponds were shrinking. By the first week of July, the thermometer on the co-op office wall read over 100 degrees by 10 in the morning, and it did not come down. It was not an ordinary heat. The air itself seemed to sit on the land and refuse to move. And across the whole southern plains, people began to understand that this was something they had not seen before. And in that heat, 40 miles of cattle were drinking from tanks kept full by electric pumps. Pumps that all drew their power from the same overloaded grid. On the afternoon of July the 15th, 1980, the power went out. It did not flicker and come back. The heat had driven demand past anything the system was built for. Every air conditioner, every fan, every irrigation motor in 4 states pulling at once. And somewhere up the line, the grid gave way. Across the panhandle, in a single afternoon, the electric pumps stopped. For a few hours, nobody worried. The power had gone out before. It always came back. But the sun went down that night, and the lines stayed dead, and it came up the next morning hotter than the day before, and still the pumps sat silent. By the second day, the stock tanks were dropping. Cattle in that heat drink 20, 30 gallons a day, and a full tank in a 108-degree afternoon does not last long with 50 thirsty heads standing over it. Men who had never in their lives worried about water stood over their tanks, watched the level fall, and felt something cold move through them despite the heat. By the third day, the cattle were in trouble. A cow will not last long without water in that kind of heat. A day, maybe two, before she goes down and does not get up. All across the northern half of Cimarron County, the herds that Wendell Kroll had spent 30 years bringing electric water to were standing over dry mud, bawling, beginning to die, and on Emmett Roth's ground, and on every leased quarter where he had set up an old mill, 19 windmills turned slow in the hot, dry wind, because a heat dome that kills a power grid does one other thing. It moves a great deal of air. The wind that came with that heat was not much, but it was enough. A water-pumping windmill does not need a gale. It will start turning in a 7-mile-an-hour breeze, and the hot, rising air over that scorched plain gave it more than that most of the day. All through the blackout, while the electric pumps sat dead, Emmett Roth's windmills kept pulling water up out of the ground one slow stroke at a time, and his tanks stayed full. Emmett saw what was coming before his neighbors did. On the second day, he had started opening gates. He drove his own 40 head to the big tank under the mill by the section corner, and then he got in his truck and drove to the nearest neighbors and told them to bring their cattle to his water. By the third day, the word had gone up and down the roads, and they came. Herds pushed on foot and hauled in trailers, converging on a handful of old steel towers that 3 days earlier had been the joke of the county. There was water at every one of them. Not much pressure, not fast, but steady. A windmill does not stop to rest, and the tanks filled as fast as the cattle could pull them down. Men who had laughed at Emmett Roth for 30 years stood in his lot and watched their animals drink, and did not know what to say to him, and mostly said nothing. Emmett didn't need them to. He just kept the gates open and the tanks full, and moved from mill to mill, checking the water, greasing a gear, the same as any other day. Not one head of cattle was lost on the water Emmett Roth's windmills pumped. Wendell Kroll came on the afternoon of the third day. He came in his own truck, not the co-op truck, and he came because his own family's cattle, his son's herd, on the home place north of town, were among the ones standing over dry mud, and there was nowhere else to take them. He drove into Emmett's lot slow, and he sat in the truck for a minute before he got out, and then he walked over to where Emmett stood by the big tank under the section corner mill. The two men stood there a while. The windmill turned above them, the pump rod rising and falling, the water running into the tank in a thin, bright stream and spilling over the lip into the mud. "I've got 200 head with no water, Emmett," Kroll finally said. He was not a young man anymore either. "My son's whole operation." "Bring 'em," Emmett said. "There's room at the North Mill." "Wind's holding." Kroll looked up at the tower, at the thin blades turning against the white sky, the same tower he had offered 30 years ago to tear down and replace. He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 30 years telling this county you were a fool," he said. "I know it," said Emmett. "You could have told me why." Emmett looked at him. "I did," he said. "You laughed." Kroll took off his hat and stood there in the heat with it in his hands, an old man looking at a thing he had been wrong about for 30 years, and could not unbe wrong about now. "The line'll come back," he said, almost to himself. "It's a better pump, 99 days out of 100. "It is," Emmett agreed. "I never said it wasn't." He nodded at the windmill. I just kept one that runs on the day it doesn't. Kroll went and got his son's cattle. They drank at the North Mill that evening, and the power did come back 4 days later, the way Kroll said it would. But by then everyone in Cimarron County had already seen the thing they could not unsee. Here is what was real about that summer. The heat wave of 1980 was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern American history. Across the central and southern United States, temperatures held above 100 degrees for weeks. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the heat and the drought that summer killed an estimated 1,000 to 1,400 people and caused around $20 billion in damage in 1980 dollars. The load it placed on electrical grids across the plains was severe, and outages during peak demand were real, and the windmill was real. After the Rural Electrification Administration brought power to the plains in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, hundreds of thousands of water-pumping windmills were abandoned across the American West, pulled down for scrap or left to rust, replaced by electric pumps that were, on nearly every ordinary day, genuinely better. A working windmill needs no fuel and no power line. It asks only for wind, and on the day the grid goes down, that turns out to be the one thing it has that nothing else does. Wendell Kroll was not a fool, and he was not a villain. For 30 years, on the plain arithmetic of ordinary days, he was right. Emmett Roth never argued that he wasn't. He only believed something the whole county had forgotten in the rush toward the future, that a system with a single way to fail will, someday, find it. So here's the question I'll leave you with. In your own life, on your own place, how many of the things that keep you alive run on a single line? And when was the last time you greased the old iron that everyone told you to pull down? Tell me below. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do.